Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Kosta Kalpos, the head of Global Government Affairs and Public Policy at Okta. Kosta, it's so nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to talk about IT policy. The Government Services Administration is changing the way it is procuring software. The OneGov approach is really trying to deal directly with OEMs and moving away from the value-added reseller market. What do you think the significant long-term challenges are that the government's going to face as it takes this approach?
Yeah, I want to first kind of call back to the last kind of 10 or 15 years in technology. When I was in government, I went and worked in accreditation at the DoD. I integrated technologies inside, for 8 years at CISA, a program called Einstein, so it was intrusion detection and prevention systems. And one of the things that I saw over the last 15 years in technology was this evolution in the speed of innovation, just in the broader market, and then how the federal government would adopt that innovation. So I read a Forbes article recently that said that the concept to market is now around 3 years compared to 15 years ago where we were around like 5 to 8 years. Based on how the acquisition cycles are now, if you go from the RFI, RFP release all the way through protest and kickoff, and implementation, you're already at a 3-year process. So by the time you're buying the new thing, you're buying the next new thing. So really, I think one of the other areas that GSA is looking at is how are we also transitioning from, if you go back 15 years, we were more under single source monolithic developments, one castle. Now we have more complex modular ecosystems. So how are we moving that plethora of hundreds, if not thousands of applications to work inside of this more modular ecosystem? So I think the incentive from GSA to work with them directly and to sell, OEMs to sell directly, isn't necessarily, at least from what I've heard, don't work with the resellers. Like you can still use that for liability protection and like all these other things, but we want to have a conversation directly with you. And I think it also has a more nuanced approach that's going to help with some integration challenges that we've had in the past when it comes to things like interoperability and such.
Well, tell me more about those integration challenges, because that's a topic that's come up quite a bit in the conversation of the OneGov approach.
Yeah. So I love this conversation because when I was at CISA, I spent 8 years getting mandates from OMB and GSA directives that would call out specific timelines or things to do. And as an integrator, I always thought, do they know what, that we can't do that just from a technical term. So I went to work there at OMB for a number of years just to kind of get some additional insights. One of the areas that I thought was, I don't want to say necessarily lacking or, there was this clear vision that I had, but I always considered integration cost up front. So, if a product is entering into the, to this new space, they're going to be pitching it in terms of the O&M cost, the year-over-year cost. Now, the integration cost is not necessarily quantified or it's subjective. So how are we trying to form and harmonize things like NIST standards, the GSA OneGov model, the new FAR rewrite, all of these kind of new bites at the apple to be able to cut down some of those front-end integration costs. And if you think about, let's say we have a contract that's par value $100,000, and you buy it, you plug it into your system, and all of a sudden you have some interconnection issues that needs to have additional time that adds scope creep to the contract. Now you're talking about an additional task order. Maybe you have, a $10,000 task order on $100,000, and you're slowly increasing the cost. And that's relatively common that we'll have these like task orders that need to be put into place, or when you're replacing a system, you would have an additional year to try to get this legacy system out and then this other system in. So I do think that the GSA approach is relying a lot on public-private partnership, but I do think they're heading in the right direction.
Well, you mentioned integration there, and there's another I word that comes up in this space a lot, which is interoperability. So do you think folks are clear on the difference between integration and interoperability?
Some are. I think that there's a interoperability. We used to call them interconnections. I think in software interoperability is more, how are we able to have, all of these pieces of software that interconnect with other pieces of software in a way where you can kind of plug and play them in your space. Like when we were talking about GSA, the acquisition model, if we go back again 10 years ago, it would take, it was like the launch pad that took the space shuttle to the little machine that took the space shuttle to the launch pad. Very complex, large IDIQs, large GWACs. We need more like the Pinto acquisition. We need more smaller acquisitions that deal with more, that fit the modular buying practice. And I was very surprised about how the FAR actually called out interoperability inside of their what they call their practitioner perspectives. So right now on acquisition.gov, you have pieces of the FAR clauses being put out for public comment, and it's plain text, and it's not a formal Federal Register process for the interim rule. But what they're doing is that they're trying to get feedback early so they can start drafting while right now they're just taking away language. Like when they're lining out the language, it's all takeouts. I actually brought a piece inside that from FAR Part 39, and it was the practitioner's perspective for buying government technologies. And they actually called out, and this is verbatim, when lock-in limits competition and innovation, government agencies lose the flexibility to evolve their digital services. To prevent these dynamics, consider these principles, and they put out 3 principles. One was mandating code sharing, open standards, and interoperability. And when I read the language that defined what that mandating code sharing, open standards, interoperability was, I was like, someone got it. They called out technology contracts should be required to use open application program interfaces or APIs, open data formats, and cloud agnostic architectures to allow easy updates and integrations for new solutions to maximize it to the extent practicable. And they also said avoid proprietary dependencies unless they are clearly justified. And then they also went into aligning with modular contract practices and building transition-ready contracts. I thought that was, when we talk about not just interoperability, but proprietary dependencies, it's not that tools are built where they have these proprietary dependencies that are considered, technical barriers. We just have tools that were built, 30, 35 years ago. So they're built off a backbone that their current, more modern systems are also interconnected with. So how do we as a community work and adopt interoperable systems so we allow the customer to have more of an innovation story? It's the use of innovation, it's the right of the customer to be interoperable, and it's the responsibility of the vendor to provide that to them.
So you mentioned harmonizing all of the documentation that defines interoperability, NIST standards, DoD directives, GSA, and the FAR. How do you want to bring all of those pieces together so that both the vendors and the clients have a clear understanding of what this is?
Yeah, I wish I had the crystal ball. I do think that there's areas, that untapped resources that the government really hasn't looked at holistically. And I think that's open standards when it comes to all of the different segments in the technology market, whether it be niches in cybersecurity, like for Okta, within the identity market. We are working with our competitors, with all of our competitors through the OpenID Foundation, producing a standard called Interoperability, Profiling, and Secure Identity Enterprise, or IPSI. And really what that is it's a working group to develop interoperability and security profiles for existing specifications. So we're all working together to say, hey, let's devil's advocate each other, work together and create an open standard so we can, work within this market holistically, and then we can also provide greater security. You're seeing this across the hyperscalers, you're seeing this across a lot of areas within software, and it's investments that private sector is making inside this from a global perspective. That goes into things that are going to broaden identity beyond just a simple SSO or single sign-on. We're talking now about universal logout, that you're giving the downstream cyber operator the ability to universally log out from one button all the applications from an end user state. And that's part of level 2 inside of the IPSI standard. And I think right now the timing is also perfect because we do have our level 1 IPSI standard being finalized sometime by the end of the year or early next year. So it kind of marries with what the FAR is doing right now. I do think that the open standards is probably one of the more objective ways of solving the problem.
And how is the government's response to the industry approach here?
I think that they're starting to call out the use of open standards. I think the question is how do we, if I put my government hat back on, I don't want any of the technical best practices to dive into competition policy. I think that there has to be this kind of, a little bit of a hand away from, what the private sector is doing because they don't want it to influence competition policy. So I think that's a good practice, and I do think that going through the regular, regulatory comment periods, the NIST comment periods, they've opened up a number of new NIST public standards for inspection. I think that's the way of doing it. I do think that by the signal of them opening these up for public comment that haven't been before, that's to me is a signal that they're looking at this seriously.
So Kosta, when we went to the break, we were talking about bringing in an open standards approach to how the government acquires information technology and software. From your perspective, how does current public policy, including a move or not a move to open standards, how does that address the long-term challenges in federal IT?
Yeah, there's been this long conversation around technical debt associated with modernizing technology. I mean, we've been trying to modernize technology since before the Tony Scott federal CIO days, when we were doing PIV two-factor authentication. I do think that when we look at how we can create smarter purchasing on the front end, how can you have this centralized buying at GSA happening right now. You have all of these procurement officers, not necessarily at the agencies anymore, but now centralized at GSA. So how are we formulating these type of acquisitions in a way that are more prescriptive, that also call out, here is the reference architecture, here is the recipe of my soup, and then how, can your product address the things in my soup? So I think from a public policy standpoint, and it doesn't necessarily need to be through a mandate, it can be through a playbook. From a public policy perspective, I think it's some level of attestation when it comes to how you're able to interoperate and configure inside an existing infrastructure, and calling out those interoperability states. So when you're making the purchase, there's some level of understanding on what's to come in terms of cost. I'll also say, complementary to that, in many areas, if a customer buys Okta, for example, or let's say Acme Inc., and then it's a specific product that doesn't have to do with data in transit. And there may be some other area where data in transit costs go up because of the product. Now, that's not going to be seen because the cost centers are separate. So being able to call and attest to the kind of the recipe of the soup to be interoperable allows to have a better holistic understanding for the government and the agency to make budgetary decisions in a more objective way.
So we're talking about software primarily. What about hardware?
Hardware is interesting because there is more technical debt inside the hardware space just because we can do things more virtually and patch and update. So that's where I think the open standards plays a more key role, where how are we looking at inside of our own niches inside technology to develop open standards to create more interoperable spaces. And then the version 2.0 of that is like, how are we working as a community to alleviate technical debt to help community members and to help channel partners inside of that space. So there's harmonization between the hardware side, the software side. There's a collection already of hardware, software bill of materials, or hardware bill of materials, software bill of materials. So we have the metadata. It's like, how do we take that metadata and then formulate it with our best in breed standard that we work with competitors, and then how do we then unify those silos into a more holistic view?
So you've been talking about policy, practice, you even said playbooks and guidance. At the core of that is a legislative foundation. So what do you think needs to be the cornerstones of a new legislative approach to modernizing federal IT?
It's a very hard landscape right now in the legislation, to be able to find consensus across aisles when it comes to technology. I think one of the areas that we want to kind of think about when we're thinking about legislation is the effect to national security, the effect from a threat actor. Also, when it comes to how are we securing against, AI. I mean, it's the new DC buzzword. I think the new tech community buzzword. But AI has been around since before the 80s. I mean, in 1985, they had something called AI Winters, which was the first real investment inside research and development into AI. And the only thing that scaled AI really was the computing power. And now it's accelerated so dramatically that we're seeing main uses of generative AI being used. But now we're going to have more agnostic AIs, bots making decisions with other bots on behalf of an organization. That's where I think there needs to be some intersection with legislation or some regulation that deals with how are we looking at the security of that. Traditionally, if we're trying to remediate a threat from our environment, it's trying to find the red marble inside a bucket of marbles, of blue marbles. With agentic AIs, it's more dropping a drop of red dye in a bucket of water. It's, how do you parse that out when that AI agent has not necessarily free reign, but the guiding principles to move freely across an environment. I do think that identity serves as a cornerstone position inside that, and trust in general, not just within inside of our systems, but for community trust as well. So I do think that identity plays a pivotal role in that.
So one of the challenges of legislation is it's often very proscriptive, things you must do, can't do. And the environment that you're describing is very flexible, very responsive.
Yeah.
And you'd almost want to have legislation that creates a permission environment as opposed to a rule-based environment. How would you suggest approaching that?
Right now, I think there's emphasis on the policy legislation, leaning on, privacy legislation, leaning on privacy to educate AI. And some other new technologies. What I do think you have is too early to provide prescriptive language that limits certain things. There was the talk about moratorium inside of the reconciliation bill. It went from 10 years down to 5 years. Then they're like, let's maybe do 2 now. And they're still talking about that. I don't know the objective nature of why that's good or bad. What I do know is that we want to be able to innovate. We want to be able to do things at speed, but we want to do them safely. We want to think about things like, ethical engineering, using synthetic data to train AI. But how do we do that and then educate the policymakers in a way that they can make more prescriptive legislation? I don't think we're there yet. I think right now it's trying to understand what would the impacts be to U.S. innovation? What would the impacts be to the broader market?
Well, speaking of legislation, we have some recent examples. The reconciliation bill included billions of dollars to update and modernize DoD's logistical backbone. So we've been talking about IT infrastructure sort of generally, but this is a very specific example. Why do you think they focused so much on the logistics backbone in this legislation?
Yeah, when I was doing accreditation at the DoD, the DoD does a very good job on classifying its assets and classifying its systems on which ones need more priority. When they have they define them in Cat 1, 2, and 3 systems. So a Cat 1 system is, the GPS on the Humvee goes out, there's an effect to the warfighter, where a Cat 3 system might be the veterinary records for service animals, Fido got his shot. But there's always been this talk about the harmony between physical security and cybersecurity. And you can have the most secure, SOC operations and spaces, but if the infrastructure side, the actual on-premise infrastructure side, isn't matching up to the sophistication of what's inside there, you have this physical demilitarized zone, this physical environment that isn't matching that same loss that would be on the battlefield. So I think policy is also calling for embedding AI in automation, which, as we're starting to modernize things inside of our technical stack, we need to modernize things on our physical stack too. And that is something that's going to help with combating the threat actors. We talked about the example of the red and the red marble versus the red ink. I think that as agentic AI agents have been traditionally in test environments, they are now moving into production. So it's critical to start investing in all of the areas within technology, not just the ones that are strictly working to war fighters down range.
So how big is the interoperability problem when you start to talk about DoD's logistics backbone?
Yeah, I think they have a little bit of I'm not going to use, maybe not the word is easier than the federal civilian, but they have a less complex ecosystem. Federal civilian has one agency, has one internet service provider, another agency has another. So you have this kind of wild, wild west of independent ecosystems. Where in the Department of Defense, you have like one generalized ecosystems where all the branches connect to the NIPR, SIPR nets. So interoperability, I think it goes back to legacy technologies, and we were talking about the hardware and the software component of that. I do think that there is an element of, when it comes to identity and credential access management, that how the DoD and how the new DoD CIO, when they come in, and the DoD CISO, start working to modernize their stack in an interoperable way to allow for additional reduction inside of the supply chain. Another area that I know that DoD is very focused on is transitive dependency risks, meaning that if you have certain elements inside of your stack that aren't interoperable, it could cut down runtime. Which then, even if it's from a Cat 3 system or a Cat 1 system, it can directly or indirectly affect the warfighter. That also starts with the modernization and improving the legacy technologies in a way you're also cutting down costs so you can modernize at scale.
So when you think about everything that we've covered today, from policy to process to guidance to legislation to practice, what are the key measures of success for you?
The key measures of success for me would be seeing the speed of innovation in government be adopted to meet on the acquisition side. It would also be wonderful to see, with this new revamp and consolidation to GSA buying, a nod to open APIs. I think if we start there, I mean, the administration had a very strong focus on commercial first software first approach. Software was a very, very large part of the DOGE executive order, the cybersecurity executive order revamp. So I think if we start with open standards, open APIs, and trying to understand how we can cut down cost on the integration side, front end, so we can get to O&M faster. I think that one small issue then starts to scale the tech modernization journey. So I think all of us in the community are starting to have conversations on where that avenue is the right avenue to approach. Is it through legislation? Is it through OMB mandate? Is it through CISA and DoD operational directives? Where would there be the most bang for your buck? But those would be my green grass wish list.
This has been a great conversation.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank today's guest, Kosta Kalpos, the head of Global Government Affairs and Public Policy at Okta. I'm Federal Drive host Terry Gerton, and you're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Okta.